Hello, this video is the second part in a series, so please click over here to see the first video if you haven't. I'm sorry to have kept you waiting for this one, but I hope you enjoy it. Alright, now we can finally start doing some chords. Sorry that I've taken so long to get to this, but all the information I had to give you before we started this is going to be very helpful. Because a lot of the more complicated stuff, you don't even really need to know if you have those basics down. That's not to say it's not worth learning, but you might come to implicitly understand the more complicated stuff anyway, even if you aren't fully conscious of it, just by keeping these fundamental rules in mind. So, how do we start? Well, usually the easiest way to start with chords is a triad. A triad is the absolute most normal chord. It's 3 notes, the first note in your scale, the third note in your scale, and the fifth note in your scale. Of course, the fact that it uses both the first and fifth means already it's harmonizing quite well. And the third one doesn't clash too much as well because it has a decent amount of space between them. The typical chord is 3 notes instead of any other number of notes, because once you get to 4, it becomes impossible to not create a chord where at least 2 of the notes are only 1 space apart within the scale. The obvious example here would be to try and add a B onto this chord, which looks right until you realise that B is just below C, even though it's the C an octave up. But we've already established that it still matters even though we are not playing C6, because we are playing C5 and C6 is just double the pitch of C5. These are still going to clash a little bit, but it certainly wouldn't sound unpleasant. In fact, there is a name for that chord too, it's called a 7th chord. You might find it a little unintuitive that a 7th chord has 4 notes as its defining feature and not 7 notes, but it's called a 7th chord because it uses the 7th note in the scale. Either way, let's hear a C major triad. Now doesn't that sound pleasant? Well, if a little boring. This is why I specifically decided to describe it as the most normal chord. Because while it would technically be right to say it's the most harmonious chord, I worry that might come off as a little bit misleading. Saying that it's the most harmonious chord kind of implies that it's the best chord, but if that were true, then all music would just constantly repeat triads, wouldn't it? It is technically true that it is the most harmonious chord, but the issue with that is that there's no tension in it. It already sounds like it's resolved, like there's no problem here. If we want our music to become a bit more interesting, we're going to have to start using other chords. But that's not to say that starting with a triad is a bad idea. In fact, it's probably best to use a triad at the start. I would generally advise that unless you have a specific plan in mind or a specific idea of why you should use another chord, that you should generally start with a triad or maybe a 7th chord. And then from there add the tension by making the following chords the variations on the triad you started with that sound a little bit more tense. Why don't you give it a go now? Try adding another 3-note chord on the second beat. Alright, so you've made a C-E-A chord. Don't worry about this appearing lazy, like you've just copied your last chord. This is definitely a trap I fell into early on. This kind of need to be as original as possible and have as little repetition as possible. It's actually not the best way to go about things. The truth is that repetition and building on previous ideas is what creates meaning in music. And so if you're constantly trying to mix up your notes and your patterns, while the variety is respectable, it often makes it very hard to make meaningful sounding music. That's not to say that music can't be complicated, but having a repeating motif is an important part of creating meaning to things. It's as I mentioned earlier, we want to create chords that build on this starting triad. So don't beat yourself up about having made the chord extremely similar, because this is actually a very intelligent chord to move to next. I am not even saying that to be patronizing, this actually works very well even though it seems very simple. And this is kind of the beauty of music, because this one slight note change completely recontextualizes the chord. Now you are playing a suspended C major triad. Suspended simply means that it's a triad, but one of the notes has either been knocked 1 position up or 1 position down in the scale. But it's not just that, it's also doing something else. This comes off as a very natural development that kind of changes the tone of the music a slight amount as well. Because of the fact that this chord is also an A minor triad, you just put the A on the top instead of the bottom. You might not have intended to do that, but that's what you did. The first note of A minor is A, the third note is C, and the fifth note is E. So an A minor triad is A, C, E. And that's the exact chord you have here, only the order is slightly different. It's C, E, A. Which does have an effect on the sound, but your brain can still pick up it's the exact same note relationships you would have in an actual A minor chord. And this is a good thing too. You might have remembered towards the beginning of the video when I said that major scales are happy and minor scales are sad. You might have thought that was a bit of an oversimplification. And it kind of was. Of course, I'm making this video to try and be more simple and easy on beginners. But it's also kind of true, and it means that when music is very obviously just major or just minor, it becomes boring. But of course, it's quite difficult to constantly slip in and out of major and minor scales and try and do it smoothly in the middle of a track, especially for someone who isn't super invested in music theory and is maybe more interested in the sound design side of things. So this is one of the best ways that you can have some ambiguity about how major or minor your piece is without having to actually change what scale you're playing and go through the trouble of trying to smoothly transition between scales and remember what scale you're in at what time. Because even if you choose not to change your scale throughout your piece, you can still kind of invoke the emotions of other scales by using their signature chords, which might still use the notes that fit into your scale, even if they are not from the same scale. Because of course, a scale is 7 notes, whereas a triad is 3. So even if these notes of A minor aren't exactly the same as C major, we only need 3 of them to be the same. And sure enough, A minor does have A, C, and E. All you did was copy the chord beforehand, but change the top note to be 1 position in the scale higher, and yet you've added all this depth to the piece. And this is also why making music can be such a, inconsistent thing. Starting is so incredibly difficult because you have nothing, or what you have is basic and uninspiring. But then once you have a start, you can take what you have and make the tiniest, most insignificant adjustments and actually get massively meaningful and amazing results, even unintentionally, quite easily. So hopefully after that you're feeling encouraged. Go on, how about you try adding another chord? E, G, B. I see where you're going there. You've taken the same shape as in the first triad, where we have 3 notes, each with a 1-note gap in between them within the scale. But instead of starting from the first note, you're starting from the 3rd note, E. And of course, as you know, because you've used this shape, which keeps the notes nicely spaced apart, it harmonizes quite nicely. However, there is still a little bit of tension to this chord, this sort of climatic feeling like it's building to something. I wonder why that is. Could it be because you've done it again? You don't even realize, but you've invoked a minor scale. Because yes, E, G, B is an E minor chord. The first note of E minor is E, the 3rd note is G, and the 5th note is B. And this will work very nicely for what I want to do next. I won't do this often, but let me actually step in and do the last chord for you. Because I have an idea for a chord that should end this off quite nicely, and the reason it should is based off of something I haven't mentioned yet. Cadences. Essentially, a cadence is how a piece ends, or at least a section of it ends at the very least. It typically refers to 1 note being played and then going to the first note in the scale from that note, and it can refer to just the notes on their own or chords being played based on those notes. And the typical way you should end a piece of music to make it sound the most complete is a perfect cadence. A perfect cadence is the 5th note in a scale or a chord built off of the 5th note in the scale, going to the 1st note in the scale, or again, alternatively, a chord based off of the 1st note in the scale. Now, a perfect cadence isn't always objectively the best way to end a piece, in the same way a triad isn't always the objective best way to start a piece. But it's generally the nice sounding option, and again, there's nothing wrong with trying a different cadence, but if you don't know what cadence you want to be using here, you should probably try a perfect cadence first. So if we take the 5th note in the scale, G, and we make a triad out of it, similarly to how we made a triad with the 1st note, C, we get G, B, D. So in C major, a perfect cadence should be going from a G, B, D chord to a C, E, G. And, sure enough, that sounds quite pleasant. If a bit boring, but again, same as with triads. I would also like to add that, even though we aren't using it in this example, an imperfect cadence would also be a good way to end this. An imperfect cadence is the same thing, but based off of the 4th note instead of the 5th. It typically does sound like the end of something, but doesn't sound like everything's resolved. It's usually used to either signal the end of a section, but not the end of an entire piece, or as a kind of fake-out ending if you play the ending section of your piece more than once, and perhaps the first time you have an imperfect cadence, whereas the second time when it really ends, you have a perfect cadence. An imperfect cadence would be good here, since we are repeating this chord progression over and over, so it's not like the entire track is over once we hear this 4th chord go back to the 1st chord. That doesn't mean you can't use perfect cadences in a looping chord progression. Of course we're using one right here and it sounds fine enough, but I'd just like to bring it up as a strong alternative. Now, how does that sound? There we go, it's really taking shape now. Now, usually I would recommend having your chord progressions be 8 bars long, rather than 4 like we've done here. Although as I mentioned, a little bit of repetition is fine since it helps create meaning. So what I would usually recommend doing is making a 4 bar long chord progression, and then copy pasting it, and then changing perhaps the last 2 chords. You can mix it up however you think sounds best. But generally I think it sounds best to have the first 2 chords remain the same, but the following 2 chords change. And then for a lot of electronic music, you have your chord progression, and you can simply repeat that throughout your piece. Since a lot of the time with electronic music, once you have a chord progression, you simply repeat it because the interest comes from the sound design, not the chords. The chords are just a necessary part of making a full piece. But for speed's sake, in this example, I'm going to cut it off here. So now, we could try starting our melody. Now usually we should create a new pattern to start making this melody in, and we will put it in a separate pattern at some point. But for now, it might actually be a bit easier if instead we stay in this pattern so that we can still see and hear the chords as we make our melody. Because although you don't necessarily have to, it's generally a good idea to make your melody with the context of your chord progression in mind. It's fine because once you've made it, I can teach you how to copy and paste notes so that we can take the notes we create in this pattern and move them into another separate pattern. Alright, so for this first bar, the entire way through we are playing this C, E, G chord. So we would want the majority of the notes we use in this melody to be either C, E, or G. Once again, there is nothing wrong with using a note that isn't one of those 3 notes. However, it's probably going to stick out a bit more. That can be a good thing if we want that note to be very powerful or shocking. But it would probably come off as jarring if that note wasn't particularly interesting or important, but went against the chord. For now, it'd probably be easiest to just stick to using the same notes as in that chord though. Let's see what you can do. Nice. It may be basic, but don't let that stop you from using it. Because of what I've mentioned before about how so much of music is building on what's established. A lot of the time, some of the best music out there can be built off of what is a very boring and mundane bass. Bass with an E, not with 2 S's. Where this will get more interesting is when we develop the melody to continue into the next few bars. I mentioned how repetition could be effective. For the next bar, we probably should keep that rhythm going. But let's have a little bit of a switch up. The top note of this chord is now an A instead of a G, so we should replace every instance of G that we had in the last part of the melody with A. Oh, wait, we don't have any instances of G. But that's fine actually. I already mentioned before, this is technically a C major suspended triad, but also an A minor triad, just with the notes flipped a bit. So in this melody, we can treat it like an A minor triad to emphasize even more the fact that it could be interpreted as that. And again, if it were an A minor triad, then the bottom note would be A. So what I'm getting at is, let's repeat this again, but now instead of using C, let's use A. And that worked quite nicely. And now we can do the same thing with E. But let's not do the same thing with G. It's going to feel like this is going nowhere if we simply repeat the same thing 4 times. This feels very much like it's building up to something, so let's actually have it build up to something. Let's have this melody change itself up a bit when we get to this last bit. We can still use the notes in the chord, but let's use them in a different way, in a different rhythm. I think we have our melody. Alright then, now that we have our melody, I think that will serve as a bit of inspiration for how we should fill these remaining 4 bars, so we have a nice 8 bars before we start repeating ourselves. Let's fill in both the chords and the melody for this section. As I said earlier, it's not too bad to repeat what we had before, so let's copy over those first 2 chords, but make the last 2 chords different. Copying chords is rather simple. All you have to do is switch to the box tool so you can select multiple notes, drag a nice box around all of them, and then Ctrl-C to copy and Ctrl-V to paste. Now, what should we do for this next chord? A, C, E. Huh. I wouldn't have thought that would work, but let's listen. Actually, that does sound quite nice. I didn't expect this would sound very good because the chord before it is actually the same chord, again, just a different order. But it looks like the melody really supports this here and makes it work in this context because it starts from E, even though that's the third note in this chord, and we've usually been using the first note in the chord to build off of. That kind of almost implies that you should think of this as an EAC chord rather than an ACE chord. And I think that sounds a lot more natural considering the last 4 bars, the chord that was here, was another chord that began with E. And I see you decided to cap it off with G, C, E. That's a good idea. It's built off of that G chord again, which would be the 5th in this scale, makes a nice perfect cadence. Only it's not quite a perfect cadence because this chord isn't that G, B, D chord I mentioned. It's moved 1 up for the 2nd and 3rd note. The other thing interesting about this though is that, once again, this is the same notes as the triad for this scale, C, E, G. Only again flipped so that G is the bottom note instead of C. For our repeating chord progression, this is actually quite effective because a triad built off of the first note in the scale does work as a nice way to end a chord progression. It just sounds a little bit incomplete. It feels like more should come afterwards. If we did end here on a chord that was just built off of the first note, just C, E, G purely, that probably wouldn't be very effective because it would sound kind of boring and it'd be the exact same chord that we'd start again with, so we'd just be playing the exact same chord twice. But by flipping around the order of the notes a bit, we managed to create that impression that this isn't really a full resolution and that there's still more after this, while still making it sound like an ending because the root note of this chord is the 5th, and again that kind of implies a perfect cadence is happening. We've got this nice middle ground where it sounds satisfying enough of an end to serve as the end of this chord progression, but not so complete that it sounds like it shouldn't repeat afterwards. So there we go, we've completed our chord progression and melody. Let's listen to all of it then. Very nice. Now, you might think this sounds a little bit boring at the moment, and yes, in all honesty it does, but that is of course because this is the start. We're playing it safe, we're using a major scale, we're not doing anything funny going outside of the scale, we're not doing anything super drastic, the chords are all the same length. But now that you're able to make something basic like this, it will be much easier to learn how to do something more complex and interesting sounding. As I've mentioned in music, it's really, really hard to start, but as soon as you have something, it becomes very easy quickly to build off of that and create something quite nice and quite complex. So this is very basic and maybe a little bit uninteresting, but it's pleasant, and there's bits of it that have a lot of potential to be exaggerated or developed more on to actually make something quite interesting. Alright, now let's combine this chord progression and melody with the drums that we made earlier. They're a little rough, but well, that's what this part's for. We'll touch them up a bit. Oh yeah, you still have that strange sound effect in there. Now might be a good time to replace that with something like a clap. Yeah, that works. Now that sounds quite nice and bouncy. It doesn't have much of a strong impact to it, so we might have to do some mixing to make it sound more impactful, so I guess it's time to open up the mixer. If you look at the top left, find the view panel, click on it, and one of the options should be the 4th one down is mixer. You can also press F9 to open it. It might already be on the screen. It's this big thing in the bottom middle. And essentially this is where you put effects on your sounds and change the volumes and which ears it's in, just to make things sound good. When you first open it up, every single track will be connected to the master track, the one on the left that has the big divider in between the rest of them. If your sound is not connected to the master track, then you won't hear anything on that track. So make sure it's all connected to the master track. But that being said, before we can even do that, we have to figure out how these sounds get on these tracks in the first place. They don't start out on here, but you can easily put them on here. You have a few sounds that are already connected. The samplers that were there already when you opened up the project are already connected to tracks 1, 2, 3, and 4, and you can tell by looking to the left of the little rectangles that represent the samplers. You might notice these green lights underneath each of the tracks. If you click the green light, you'll turn that track off and you won't hear anything on it anymore. If you right-click it, you will solo it, turning off every single track except the tracks used for that sound. Just right-click again on a track that's already soloed to turn every track back on. You might have noticed though, when I solo these drums, well, it does mute almost everything except what I decide to solo. It doesn't mute the piano. That's because since we added the piano to the project, it wasn't already there, it wasn't automatically set up to be connected to the mixer, and we haven't connected it to the mixer. And so it doesn't have a track on the mixer, so it can't mute it. So let's add it to the mixer. There's a couple ways you can do that. First of all, I already showed you how there's a number corresponding to the mixer track to the left of each thing in your channel rack, and if you simply drag that number up or down, you can set the number like that. But probably the easiest way to do it is when you go onto one of your plugins, every single one should have this little arrow at the top left. If you click on it, it opens quite a few options, but the one you want is quite easy to see. On the right, there are two options, Save Channel State As and Route to Free Mixer Track. You want Route to Free Mixer Track. You can also do this using Ctrl-L. And this will automatically connect this to whichever mixer track is furthest to the left and is unused. From there, you'll be able to connect this into whichever track you want, move it around, put whatever effects you want on it, all that kind of stuff. This tutorial's been going on for a while though by now, so I think I should save the mixing for the next part. It's not something that you desperately need to even start, even though you definitely will need to once you want to try and make real quality stuff. So let me just explain some of the most basic stuff before we finish. Underneath the green dot there's this big circle, and you can simply use that to pan the sound to the left or right ear. I imagine most computers out there would have left and right ear speakers by this point, or at the very least if it is mono and doesn't have both, then it would at least make it so that it doesn't matter which ear it's in, it will sound the same. On some older devices it may only play sound through the left ear. It shouldn't do that. If it's only got one speaker, it should combine both the left and right ear into one and play that, but sometimes it only plays the left ear. If you're having an issue where a sound is muted and you can't figure out why, check if it's like in the right ear, and if it is, it might be something to do with what you're playing the sound on. It might not be able to play things on the right ear channel. We obviously have the volume slider itself. You probably can already guess what this is all about. They mark this as 100%, even though technically you can go up to 125%, because you really probably shouldn't go higher than that point unless it makes sense in the context. Essentially, you can see the volume bars above. Most sounds will start to go into the red if you push it above 100%. At the point at which the sounds start to go into the red, the quality of the sound will suffer and it will start to distort. This actually can be a good thing, because it can actually make the sound more intense and it can have effects on the sound that, while not directly designed, are actually good for it, but generally it's going to sound nasty. And then we have these three tiny little buttons. The first two I don't imagine are going to be that useful to you. There's reverse polarity, which makes it so, you know when you see a sine wave and it moves both up and down, and it's the middle that's no volume, and it's both up and down that are lots of volume. Well, reverse polarity will just replace the down with the up and the up with the down. It will just flip it vertically. This basically does not change the way it sounds. This will only matter once you start learning about phase cancellation, and even then, this is an extremely niche thing that I don't think you'll need to worry about. So essentially, don't worry about it for now. Don't touch that button. I don't think it will be useful for you, and don't worry about it. Even if you do press it by accident, it's not going to break your sound. It should probably sound exactly the same as before. You probably won't notice anything. Similarly, below it, we have swap left and right channels. Just swap to the ears that you hear things in. And the only one of these smaller things that I would consider useful is the stereo separation circle. If you turn this to the left, it will make the stereo of your sound more separated, and if you turn it to the right, it will make it more merged. Essentially what this means, in simple terms, not getting too deep into it, is that merged will make it sound more like the sound is coming from in between both of your ears, from the very center. while separated will make it sound like the sound is surrounding you. Generally, you would like the percussive, hard-hitting stuff that really smacks you to be in the center, and atmospheric stuff to be separated wide out. I would also highly recommend using this knob, even though this might sound like a small thing. Either that or Stereo Enhancer, an effect plugin made specifically for this purpose. Whenever you start to struggle with mixing too many sounds in one area, if you have a lot of sounds in one spot and it's hard to make them all feel like you can hear them all without them clashing, then I recommend putting some more separated and some more merged. It makes it more easy to hear them all without having to actually change the volume of them or mess with their frequencies. But we are starting to get a little bit advanced there, so let me slow myself down and stop right there. Just before I finish though, let's cover how to add effects and how to add plugins. How to add effects is quite simple. At the right, you'll see these 10 slots on every single track. You simply click one of the slots, and it will open up a menu. That menu will have all the plugins you'll need in it. If the menu disappears, it's just under select, so just hover over select, it'll reappear. But this menu only shows effects, and I actually haven't mentioned the normal way that you would add a new sound, a new synthesizer, a new sampler, whatever. So to do that, just go over to Add at the top left, and you'll see your list of plugins. Also, if you have a plugin already there, but you'd like to change it into another plugin without deleting it, you can right-click on it and hover over Replace and select what you want to replace it with, which is useful if you already have a chord progression or melody, you just don't like the instrument that's playing it and you want to have a different one there. Alright, I'd better stop myself there. I wanted to briefly cover the mixer because it, alongside the channel rack, the playlist, and the piano roll, is one of the most important windows you're going to be using a lot. And you do have to know how to use it to some degree to be able to really make anything properly. But anymore, I'm going to keep and hold back for a later video on mixing. Next video though will be on sound design, and how you can create your own new sounds from synthesizers inside FL Studio. And that is really where things are going to get interesting, at least from my perspective, because if you weren't already aware, when I came into music, I really had no interest in the melodic and harmonic sense of things and the music theory. I was all in on learning about the sound design. I'd definitely say that I'm a specialist in that particular aspect of music. So I feel pretty confident that I'll have you covered there. If anything about this video did leave you feeling confused though, then please comment and ask me about it. I might sometimes be a little bit slow to respond because since not that many people watch this channel at the moment, I don't check that often. But I will respond. As of right now, there are no comments on this channel that I have not responded to. And of course, again, I'd like to apologise for keeping you waiting for 3 full months for a part 2. But hey, what matters is in the end it's good, obviously. Actually, I hope you can't tell too much, but this is actually being recorded much later. Most of the voiceover for this video was recorded back in November, and this is just being recorded probably only a day before you're now watching the video. Originally, the outro that I had recorded was one of me saying Merry Christmas, because as I said in the first part at the end, I had actually planned for this second part and first part to all be one video initially. Anyway, all that being said, thank you very much for watching. I hope you appreciate these tutorials and I hope you're excited for more.